and invite JB and John. Come up here, please. Say what? I said Tom, didn't I? All right. Good morning, everyone. First of all, thank you to the Planning Committee, Jean, for inviting me to be up here. Jean, I have a bully pulpit. I'm going to take it. He said he assumed I would. So I'm Jennifer Gimbel. My title is Senior Water Policy Scholar at the Colorado Water Center at Colorado State University. I have worked on the Colorado River since 1985, first for the state of Wyoming, then Colorado, then the federal government, and again the state of Colorado, and again the federal government. So as you know, we hop around in this basin. You all know these people on the panel, and before they jump in, they have a presentation they want to give. But as I was pondering moderating these two panels and looking at piecing the puzzle together theme, I'm a fan of Alice in Wonderland and Alice Through the Looking Glass. And staff who used to work for me know that. And I kept thinking of the puzzles in Alice in Wonderland and the puzzles we have here on the river. And so I started forming this analogy. So forgive me if this sounds dumb to you, but it at least kept me up and excited about the two panels. The book's originally by Lewis Carroll, and I'm going to use the illustrations that were in the original books by John Tenniel. So first we have Alice. All of us are Alice, together or separately. These guys are Alice, a lot. She gives no thought to just diving down a rabbit hole and following this white rabbit. She doesn't know how she's going to get out, and she comes into this interesting place where people don't seem to make much sense. She follows the white rabbit. The white rabbit is a servant of the sovereign of Wonderland, the Red Queen, and the Queen of King of Hearts. But we hear more about the Red Queen. Now, he's a very conscientious and diligent employee of whatever administration is at hand. Now look at the white rabbit. Does that remind you of David Palumbo? Always running from one meeting to another, working to get things done. I love David, and I had hoped to tell him beforehand I was going to do this to him. But speaking of David, if you see him, you need to congratulate him because he just received the Presidential Rank Award for Distinguished Service. That's an incredible award. So back to Dave, the rabbit. Very concerned about time, as he should be. We've all been tick-tock, tick-tock, tick-tock. Let's see what's going on. Time's ticking, and 2026 is not that far away. So Alice comes across the Cheshire Cat. She thinks, oh, she likes cats. Cat grins and looks really friendly, but that cat has claws, and that cat has teeth. Now, in my analogy, that cat is the river flows. Some years, they're great. They're all there. Some years, they start disappearing. 2021, where do they go? cat's always smiling. And Mother Nature is saying, ha ha, I know better than you. You figure it out. Now, here's another good friend of mine on the river. Doesn't that cat remind you of Chuck Cullum? I love Chuck. So next, through the looking glass, Alice comes across the Tweedle twins, Tweedledee and Tweedledum. Well, you can guess who those are, the Upper Basin and the Lower Basin. Now, in this story, they're identical twins. In real life, they're fraternal twins. They have a lot in common, and they have a lot of differences. And you're going to hear a lot about that today in these two panels. Then we have the Queen of Hearts, off with her head. And there are so many people on this river that could be the Queen of Hearts. But the first that came to my mind was Secretary Gail Norton in the early 2000s when the river was crashing, and she said, states, you figure out how to better manage this river, you come to consensus, you do it, or I will. That drove the states to figure out the 2007 guidelines. Sally Jewell came along, kind of gave the same message. Well, what we did wasn't good enough, we got to do more. And I think we could even look to Commissioner Connor, or Commissioner Lopez, Commissioner Berman, or Commissioner Tootin as that Queen of Hearts, bringing the tables to negotiate. Well, the other two famous characters are, of course, the Smoking Caterpillar and the Mad Hatter. Does anybody up here, you want to take a shot at that? Okay, no. In my mind, the caterpillar is abrupt, impolite, overly inquisitive, frustratingly contrite. However, he does give advice to Alice on how to navigate Wonderland, how to adapt to her circumstances. He advises her to keep her temper. He tells her which side of the mushroom makes you larger and which side makes you small. And of course, according to Jefferson Airplane, some mushrooms don't do anything at all. I knew half of you would get that at least. So I think of the caterpillar as maybe our legal representatives. Always thinking, keeping in line and looking at what we need to do. Mad Hatter, well, what did he do? He made hats. Some of them were magical, some of them not. So those are our engineers on the river. Then we have Queen's Garden, where the Queen's men are painting roses, because the Queen wants red roses, and the roses grew white. And sometimes I think, as we look at the last 25 years on this river, maybe we spent too much time painting roses. And maybe we need to think a little bit deeper about how to approach this. The other slide there is the walrus and the carpenter. And this is a wonderful story of two folks who asked the clams to go on a hike, and at the end of the hike, have lunch. Well, the clams are the lunch. Now, sometimes the Upper Basin thinks it's the clams. Sometimes the Lower Basin thinks they're the clams. So and those roles change throughout. And by the way, since some of you old folks are here, the Beatles song, I Am the Walrus, comes from this poem. And the song makes no sense, so they did that on purpose. So, here we are. We are not in a story. We are here in real life, and we have real life problems to deal with. We need to ignore the noise that goes on and come together as a community and figure out how we're going to manage this river. That last picture is the unicorn and the lion who Alice met through the looking glass. And she had a cake, and they asked her to divide the cake, and she did. And the lion roared, "You gave the unicorn twice as much as I have." And the unicorn said, "So what? Let's figure out how to do this equitably." And with that, I'm going to turn the panel. I believe there's a presentation that they have, and I'll let them do that, and then we'll ask some questions.
Good morning. For anybody that doesn't know me, I'm John Entsminger. I'm the general manager of the Southern Nevada Water Authority. Thank you for that introduction, Jennifer. In talking about this, I think I've been on this stage, 10 or 15 times over the years, and I don't think we've ever used slides before. And the reason we decided to do that is because of the changing composition of this conference. I think anybody that was at Chris Harris's retirement ceremony last night, he said this is his 34th CRWUA. and he's probably not the longest tenured attendee by far, but I also know that there are people that this is their first CRWUA or their second CRWUA. So we wanted to provide some context of what we think the Lower Basin has accomplished over the last 20 to 25 years in order to show where we're going in the post-26 negotiations, because Carly did a really good job of kind of showing the effort that's gone on over the last 18 to 24 months, but that wasn't where we started, right? I think she said we're at the 50-yard line or at halftime or something like that. But we're 25 years into adapting this river and all of the laws and institutions and relationships that go into managing this river. So I think it's important to have that context. So we're just going to run through some stuff real quick. Anybody who's ever visited Lake Mead, certainly if you lived in Las Vegas in the 1980s, we took field trips to the dam and saw it spilling, and you see how far it's down. But what we're going to show you is this could be way worse. As bad as these three pictures are, that water level on the right for today, that could be about 140 feet lower than it is right now, but for the actions of the states and the water users in the Lower Basin. So just reviewing, that timeline, since really the turn of the century, we've had the quantification settlement agreement, the interim guidelines that first allowed the Lower Basin states to start banking ICS, all of our cooperative agreements with Mexico, Minute 319, Minute 323, pilot system conservation, and then the big DCP in 2019, 500 plus, and then the biggest conservation plan in the history of the river, the 3 million acre feet that we accomplished during this administration. And if you add all of those up, you can see that if we hadn't done any of that, the elevation of Lake Mead today would be 921 feet above sea level. But instead, it's 1,064 feet above sea level, a difference of 143 feet. So I bring this up, and Tom, JB, and I wanted to make this point, not to pat ourselves on the back, but to show that change is possible. A step at a time, a program at a time, a board vote at a time. Sometimes the challenges on this river seem almost overwhelming, but day by day, month by month, year by year, we in this room can make a difference, and we can effectuate change and protect this river. So we're going to go through just briefly sort of what each state has done, and then just briefly some highlights of the Lower Basin proposal, and I think I'll turn it to Tom.
Thanks, John. And I am Tom Buschatzke, the Director of the Arizona Department of Water Resources, and Governor Hobbs' representative for the state of Arizona in these Colorado River discussions. So it's important, I think, to us, as John said, to show that change is possible and to show where some of that change has evolved over time. So again, Arizona's consumptive use is shown on the slide, and you can see starting in 2014, we started reducing our consumptive use through various mechanisms, either voluntary conservation or later mandatory cuts. And we'll have a slide on that one in a bit, but pointing to the far end, the far right-hand part of this graph, you can see in 2023, we're down to 1.9 million acre-feet of consumptive use in Arizona from 2.8 million acre-feet. That's a significant reduction, 800,000 acre-feet. A heavy lift, but our water users came to the fore on voluntary conservation, and unfortunately, some of them also had mandatory cuts to take under the 07 guidelines under contributions for the drought contingency plan. So again, this is showing in purple the mandatory shortage and reductions under the guidelines in DCP. But even with pretty big mandatory reductions, our water users have found a way to do more. And I hope that that is part of the basis for post-2026 management as well. There's going to be some perhaps mandatory outcomes that Carly talked about. She talked about the priority system. But beyond that, we've shown we're willing to do more. And again, back starting in 2014, we've reduced use by over 4.6 million acre-feet in Arizona. That is a hugely impactful number for our state, our water users. So this graphic is a representation of what some of the water users in our state will feel in terms of reductions if the 760,000 acre-feet that Arizona put in the alternative in March of the 1.5 million acre-feet of the Lower Basin static reductions actually gets implemented in a strict priority system. On the left, again, in my state, tribes have about half of the Colorado River water, and of the Central Arizona Project water, which is about 1.4 to 1.5 million acre-feet annually, they have about half of that water as well. So they will be hugely impacted. The Gila Riverine community would lose 49% of their water. The Tohono O'odham Nation, 49%. Fort McDowell, San Carlos, those are huge reductions facing our tribal partners in our state. But our cities are on the hook too. Phoenix, my former employer, 37% reduction. Tucson, 20%. That's where the two biggest populations, right, in Arizona reside. So these are really scary numbers for our water users. And I think when you hear later in the presentation what the Lower Basin alternative really was about, was these numbers, we're going to take them, we're going to find a way to deal with them, but that's not enough. The 1.5 million acre-feet is not enough. We need more. And that's where we really are looking for others in the basin to help meet those reductions that are necessary. So I'll turn it over to JB now.
Thanks, Tom. JB Hamby, California. I want to give a little bit of a story here. Look at that year, 2002, a high of 5.4 million acre feet, roughly, of California's use, and a dramatic fall down the stairs the next year to 4.4 million acre feet. That didn't happen on its own. It happened because there were federal threats, there was real work that was done between our agencies, and California permanently reduced our uses to the Colorado River by a tremendous amount. That happened through dozens of agreements. It happened through state laws that were passed to be able to assist us in that effort, a lot of programs, and no money from the state or federal levels. That was all done locally. There was enough hand-wringing, but ultimately push came to shove, and California got it done and continues to get it done to this day. We have the bulk of the agricultural productivity throughout the entire basin exists within the state of California, within our users in Imperial, Palo Verde, Coachella, Bard, Quetzal, Indian tribe. We have half the population of the entire basin that resides within our state, and we sustain $2 trillion in economic productivity that is really the engine in many ways as part of our national economy. And we've done this not by hand-wringing, but by getting stuff done. We move water throughout our state from agricultural users, largely in partnership with our urban partners on the coast of California. Hundreds of thousands of acre feet a year being conserved at great cost, either through fallowing programs, deficit irrigation programs, system efficiency, on-farm efficiency conservation programs. The list goes on in the toolbox that we use to make this massive amount of water move. It is possible, and it provides a blueprint, a much-needed blueprint throughout the rest of the basin. And we also flip water as well, in addition to those substantial amounts that we're already conserving over the last 20 years, moving significant amounts of water on top of that into Lake Mead as part of the interim agreements to be able to sustain Lake Mead through the interim period. Coachella Valley Water District, 130,000 acre feet. Bard, in partnership with Metropolitan, another 17,000 acre feet. Imperial Irrigation District is doing a total of 828,000 acre feet on top of an existing, cumulative total on top of an existing 500,000 acre feet of conservation a year as part of the QSA. Our partners in Palo Verde with Metropolitan, 389,000 acre feet being contributed to Lake Mead, and our friends at the Fort Yuma Quetzal Indian tribe also contributing 52,000 acre feet to massively increase the level of Lake Mead by something like 16 feet. So altogether, in addition, at the Metropolitan Water District last year, they left behind nearly 500,000 acre feet of water that could have been used to provide to their 19 million users throughout Southern California. They left it behind uncompensated in Lake Mead instead, and this year another 60,000 acre feet as well. This puts us well on our way to conserving 1.6 million acre feet of water by 2026, and we're all well on our way toward that initiative. We didn't complain, we didn't hand-wring, we got it done, and we're happy to provide notes to partners throughout the basin on how to get stuff done. Because it can be. Very easily.
It might have been before your time, but I might have remembered a little bit of complaining.
Complaining on the front end is okay, but there's a time for that to be done with.
You performed. That's the important part. So for Nevada, I think everybody in the room knows that we have the smallest allocation. If you include Mexico and the other 6 states, we have a robust legal entitlement to 1.8% of the river. My good friend Jack Schmidt has famously called us a rounding error when it comes to modeling on the Colorado River. But even with that being said, I think we've towed the line and we've done our part. Since 2002, we have reduced our overall consumptive use by 42%. And I think the number one lesson for people in this room is that's not free. It's not free financially. It's not free from a political capital perspective. You can see here, we celebrate probably a once-in-a-generation windfall from the bipartisan infrastructure law of $4 billion. With 1.8% of the river, we've spent about $600 million reducing our overall use through municipal conservation, tributary conservation, cooperative agreements with Mexico, and system conservation. If everybody in this room, every one of your water districts, every one of your cities was doing per capita what we're doing, this river would be in much, much better shape. Tom showed you his numbers, JB showed you theirs. We can't match that on a gross basis. We'd have to stop using water altogether, but we have contributed about 1.3 million acre feet to the river, since 2008. And then this is just the takeaway. Population growth is happening everywhere. We've welcomed, tens of thousands of Californians to our home since the pandemic. So our population is up, 52%, but our per capita use is down 58%, and our gross depletions from the river are down 42% in that same time frame. None of this is easy, but all of this is possible. And now Tom's going to go through the Lower Basin alternative for just a few slides.
Thanks, John. So again, we wanted to take this opportunity to talk a little bit about the Lower Basin alternative that we submitted in March. We're not sure how many folks in this room have really had opportunity to see the Lower Basin alternative. Perhaps they've had it described to them by some of their representatives, but we thought good opportunity to make sure people are on the same page in terms of what our alternative does. And first, we're shifting away from just using Lake Powell and Lake Mead and going to a system content philosophy for managing the river. We believe that's a better indication of the health of the river system, not just about Lake Powell and Lake Mead. It also gives you the opportunity to some degree, disassociate reductions in the Lower Basin from the coordinated operations of Lake Powell and Lake Mead, the way we do that now under the 07 guidelines and the DCP. So we've learned these lessons for what didn't work so well under the DCP and the guidelines. So the chart on the right is kind of a graphical representation of the reductions based on system contents. And you can see on the left, there are the percentages of the system. And at 69%, we start the initial reductions in the Lower Basin, ramping up at 58% of total system contents to the 1.5 million acre feet of reductions that we proposed in March. Then you stay on the static reduction zone, that vertical bar from 58% to 38%. With the last 30 years of hydrology, that 1.5 million acre feet of cuts in most situations, 75, 80%, we've protected the system, but we know there are hydrologies drier that the 1.5 is not going to be enough. And again, 1.5 was achieved in various ways, but we've heard for a long time that in the river system, in the upper basin, they take evaporation and system losses, and we have consumptive use in the lower basin. Reclamation did a study published last January, 1.2 to 1.3 million acre feet of evap and system losses in the lower basin that are helping to negatively impact Lake Mead and the river system. So that was part of the 1.5, but we wanted to also show that not only were we going to cover those evap and system losses, we were going to do a little bit more. Again, things we've heard, boxes we've checked from our discussions over the last couple of years with our colleagues in the 4 upper basin states. But again, knowing that that might not be enough, then at 38%, we propose this basin-wide reduction zone where you need to go up to 3.9 million acre feet of reductions. And this is where we have asked in our proposal that we split 50-50, and maybe other ways, but 50-50, the 2.4 million acre feet of additional reductions that are needed. We're asking the upper basin to come with us to help further protect the river, but only in those really high, dry hydrologies. And we're going to, most of the time, take our 1.5. We've heard, why didn't you start earlier than 69% in the system. We tested lots of outcomes with that number, where we would start. We tested outcomes with numbers bigger than 1.5. And this is kind of a good point. You don't want to have to risk spilling water in the system by starting too soon, but it's also painful to take the reductions. And you want to kind of have that balance, creating this insurance policy. You can go on azwater.gov, my Colorado River page, if you want to see histograms and lots of squiggly lines, as I like to call them, from modeling that show the performance of our alternative. That information's all there, and it performs really well, and it is robust, and it creates more certainty for the water users. And we just think we've put together something that is the next iteration of the evolution of how to manage this river. So one of the things we did assess is what if we would have had the ability to put this proposal in place back in 2007. And you can see in the black is the historic system contents, and in the blue, it's the system contents if we had initiated in 2007 the Lower Basin alternative. And what's important to note in this graphic is that if we had started in 07, based on the hydrology, et cetera, we pretty much stay in the static reduction zone. We don't have to dip down into the basin-wide reduction zone. You can see a little dip in 2022, 2023, but then because of the additional reductions, you recover. We think this is a great indication of the performance of the Lower Basin alternative. And again, we are taking the 1.5 anytime we're in the static reduction zone and not asking anyone else in the Upper Basin to take reductions at that point in time. So you heard Carly talk about compact compliance and that he was staying away from a discussion of compact compliance. But compact compliance is out there. It is a potential issue. What we are showing in this graphic is a comparison of the Lower Basin alternative to what compact compliance might mean. So again, you can see in the gold bar, the Lower Basin takes most of the reductions. Again, if the hydrology is worse than the last 30 years, we're going to need to do more. We're asking the Upper Basin to take the green bar, right? Pretty small piece, but if you look at averaging out compact compliance and curtailment in the Upper Basin, that could result in what the blue bar shows. That blue bar is significantly bigger than the green bar. And in my opinion, that means there's more risk in the Upper Basin to compact compliance and curtailment than there would be to sign on to the Lower Basin alternative with us. This is a really important point, and we can get into a discussion of, can compact compliance actually happen? Is it going to spur litigation? All those things. But we did put the Lower Basin alternative together in a way that we think is a reasonable compromise between the Upper Basin states and the Lower Basin states. So I think with that, that was our last slide, and I guess we'll turn it back over to Jennifer.
Thank you very much. That's a lot to unpack there, and appreciate the efforts you all put on the slides. So it brings up some questions with respect to some of those issues. And the first question I have for you all is that you talk about compact compliance. Is that the no action alternative that Carly just represented? Or is it something different?
I don't think it's the no action alternative that Carly just showed. I think, and I hope I'm not putting words in her mouth, but what I heard was they will track the LROC deficit in every alternative. So it might be demonstrating lack of compliance, but it will not be enforcing compliance, is my understanding of what they mean by no action.
And I'll just say it's not just about the 823 minimum objective release, right? It's also about equalization. It's also about moving water out of crisp reservoirs, which were expressly designed to help meet the compact requirements. So it's more than just that assessing what John described in terms of the release from Powell to Meade.
You want to jump in, JB? Okay.
Covers it well.
I'm gonna follow up with that question and say, Tom, I had the pleasure of listening to one of your meetings with your reconsultation committee. It's quite a group of people. And you mentioned to them that you felt under the compact compliance scenario that the upper basin could be out of compliance by 2027. Can you just talk about that a little bit? How did you come to that conclusion?
We've looked at what's come out of Lake Powell into Lake Meade over the last number of years and looked at where the next couple of years might be and added up, the 10 years, the 10-year rolling average, at the 823 number, not at the 7.5. Because again, we believe it's 7.5 plus half of the Mexico obligation, and 823 in the LROC recognizes that issue, that it's both 7.5 and half of Mexico. So that's how we came up with those numbers.
So also in your proposal, you talk about the upper basin reducing their flows. And I know you all understand the law of prior appropriation and the laws in the upper basin state. And the question I have, and I've gotten from other folks, is how would they do that when the state engineers don't feel they have the authority to just reduce flows outside of the prior appropriation doctrine? And JB, you and I had a bit of a conversation about that. You want to talk about that, how you guys did it at IID?
Sure. I'll talk little bit about how we can avoid that circumstance and having to push that button. I'll let Tom talk about the red button there. But really, what are we really asking for? When you saw Tom's slides, if we had implemented the lower basin approach back in 2007, there's no scenario that we would be looking at where we would actually even need upper basin contribution. Now the system is in a very different condition. Climate change has intensified, gotten worse. The reservoirs at our low elevation, but improved as a result of the lower basin conservation. But this idea that it's not physically or hydrologically possible to do water conservation in the upper basin is patently absurd. I mean, let's look apples for apples for a moment, or to just start with a basic statement. If you are using water, you can use less too. That is possible. And I'll make one little point out here. You have some propaganda sheets on your tables. If you've gotten one out, you can turn to this page. There's a statement here that says, uses in the lower basin have remained consistent or even risen. Well, that's a very different number than you saw in John's slide a few minutes ago, where you've seen a consistent drop over the last 20 years in the lower basin. But if we look to where the upper basin has been since 2007, it's not going down and to the right, it's going up and to the right. Since 2007, the upper basin's use, on average, has increased about 300,000 acre-feet per year. And included in all of these alternatives that Reclamation has looked at, that includes an analysis of the upper basin increasing their use to 6 million acre-feet, which would be larger than what the lower basin would be using, which is insanity considering 75% of the population, 2/3 of the tribes, and most all of the agricultural productivity exists in the lower basin. So I think what we're talking about here, when we get to this discussion about compact compliance, we don't want to have to get there. I mean, for one point is looking at Arizona versus California, the last time we tried something in the Supreme Court, that lasted for 52 years. I'm 28 right now. I did the number this morning. I would be 82 years old by the time we would close the book on lower basin states versus upper basin states. I would like to spend my life on something better than that, please.
Some of us are close.
So my point here is let's look apples for apples, like getting away from the Dr. Strangelove situation that there is a lot of interest in certain parts of the upper basin. Imperial Irrigation District ag and the upper basin ag is not very different. Their uses on the low end and the high end is pretty similar. On the low end, it's 2.1 million acre feet. On the high end, it's 3.1 million acre feet. Certainly, the Upper Basin is spread out across a larger area. Imperial Irrigation District is in a much more confined area where you can do something like install 1,800 locks on gates, as Imperial Irrigation District did in one day, to be able to make conservation happen this year. But how is there much of a difference here? Because in Imperial Irrigation District, there's been, on average, 160,000 acre-feet a year of conservation just on farm, not counting all the system conservation, not even counting the deficit irrigation programs that's generating up to this 800,000 acre-foot volume. Those are big numbers, but they're equivalent to what the Upper Basin could do if there was an effort to do so. I'm reminded of a recent meeting I went to, was invited to last year very kindly by our friends at the Upper Colorado River Commission. They put up on a big screen all of the contracts that they had done to generate some 20, 30,000 acre-feet of conservation in the Upper Basin. That was a very big deal. I sent a picture to Tina Shields, IID's water department manager, said, take a look at this. And she said, well, I think we get that done about every 45 minutes. And there's no difference in size between the Upper Basin and Lower Basin's water use. What the difference is a willingness to actually conserve water, not put more to use and further drain the river.
So Jennifer, I'll just add, first of all, and again, not to put words into Carly's mouth, but what I understand, and JB talked about the 6 million acre feet, demand curve, that's what's going to be modeled. They're modeling 6 million acre feet. What that means is the modeling results are going to show a performance that's going to require the Lower Basin to take more cuts on a more regular basis. So your first question, we have heard in many of the meetings with the 4 commissioners the issue about the authority to cut their water users, but I've also heard in those meetings that they might have that authority if we make a compact call. So perhaps we'll make that compact call, then they'll have the authority to cut their folks. Maybe that's an easy path compared to going to their water users with some voluntary program or their legislatures to get authorities to do the things we have to do in the Lower Basin.
Hopkins?
Oh, I have nothing to add to that.
So, speaking of authorities, I've also heard the Lower Basin say that the federal government is responsible for compact compliance and has the ability to regulate the Upper Basin. Can any of you explain where that's coming from? And maybe I've heard wrong.
Well, I think if you look at it at a fundamental level, the compact is approved by 7 state legislatures, is approved by the House and the Senate, and signed by the President. The federal government is a party to the compact. There's a compact clause in the U.S. Constitution. So yes, there are enforcement authorities out there. I personally would like to spend the rest of my career not testing those. I would much rather be talking about ways we can be cooperating with our Upper Basin neighbors than even exploring these topics publicly. But the compact is the law of the land. And if push comes to shove, I'm sure our Upper Basin friends have their interpretation of what enforcement looks like, and we have our interpretation of what enforcement looks like. But as JB said, the last time we went down this road in Arizona v. California, you don't know what's going to come out of that. Most of the people I know in the Upper Basin do not want the Secretary of Interior to have expanded authorities and be the water master in the Upper Basin. But you roll those dice, you're not sure what you're going to get out of it.
On your proposal, you talk about, at a certain level, a very low level, having equal cutoffs for each basin. Tell me how that's equitable, because if the Upper Basin is only using, they're going to be bad years, but I look at 2021, and the Upper Basin's uses were reduced by Mother Nature by 25%. Yet in the guidelines that we've been following, Arizona did get reduced no doubt about it, and it hurts, and I really appreciated the slide, Tom, about how hard that hurts. But overall, it was an 8% reduction for the basin. Can we figure, rather than this equal, is there an equitable way to get to reduction?
Well, I'm not going to argue percentage numbers because I
Well,
think
they're
we
back
we
of the
can,
envelope, so I
yeah,
admit
and
that.
and we can all come up.
I'm a lawyer being an engineer.
We can all come up with our own numbers and make ourselves look good. But what I think your question's getting at the heart of is I've heard repeatedly from the Upper Basin, the compact is an equitable apportionment agreement. And it's true, the first sentence says that, but there's 4 more pages that talk about the Upper Basin not reducing deliveries below Lee's Ferry, below 75 million over 10, about having 50% of the Mexico compact allocation, about nothing in this compact quantifying tribal water rights, about nothing in this compact affecting prior perfected rights. So when you start exploring the totality of the compact, I think it's a little bit lazy to stop at the first sentence.
So what I'll say is, I think when we, yes, well, applause for Tom, or John, excuse me.
These are Jennifer questions, not Upper Basin questions.
When we put forward our Lower Basin alternative, we were looking to offer a compromise, because a basic, simple understanding of the law of the river, as it has been historically understood, is Lower Basin gets 7.5, and then there's another half that the Upper Basin is supposed to contribute to from Mexico. Anything that's below that, in order to ensure that those compact deliveries are met, falls on the Upper Basin until you get down to PPRs. So some of our discussions is, that's pretty harsh, and we want a 7-state agreement. We don't want to have to go litigate stuff and force these really difficult outcomes in the Upper Basin. So that's what we were looking for there. Let's at least start by splitting the baby rather than forcing the Upper Basin to take all of the pain for climate change, which I found to be a persuasive argument with them over time, and that's what we went with. So we offered a compromise, and the Upper Basin, in return, offered a negotiating tactic. Let's talk about inequity, putting all 4 million acre-feet of total reductions where most of the people in the basin live, where all the food in the basin is grown. That doesn't make any sense. So at least what we're trying to do is come to a reasonable accommodation. Between Arizona and California, I think a forgotten story as part of this whole thing is we've owned most all of that 1.5 million acre-feet. Arizona and California, as I mentioned earlier, fought for 54 years in that longest Supreme Court case in the history of the court. And in last year, in 2023, and we finished it off in a house owned by Metropolitan in Rancho Cucamonga, we basically determined how we want to permanently, or at least for the next 20 years, split up these reductions between our 2 states, which is a massive deal. So that's what we've been willing to do in the Lower Basin, is overcome these huge hurdles and these historic divides. And that's what we're trying to do with the Upper Basin. That's what we put forward. But we're not going to be in a situation where 4 million acre-feet of reductions is visited upon the Lower Basin. Meanwhile, the Upper Basin increases to 6 million acre-feet and building pipelines to go build more golf courses.
Let's remember, we're all one basin. I'm going to switch gears here. Tom, did you tell me about the sticker you're wearing?
So this sticker is about the Northern Arizona Indian Water Rights Settlement, which is the Navajo Nation, the Hopi tribe, and the San Juan Southern Paiute tribe in Arizona. That settlement made it to Congress. It is based upon Arizona's Upper Basin 50,000 acre-feet of water. It's 47,000 that's out there because the other's being used. That is the water supply for those 3 tribes. Again, the biggest amount going to the Navajo Nation, the rest of the Hopi, with delivery obligations to San Juan Southern Paiute. In earlier discussions with those 3 tribes, we had Central Arizona project, low priority water on the table, which is the way we settled some of our tribal claims. We took that off the table because we made the case to the three tribes that that water is not going to be there ever again, right? At 600,000 acre feet of cuts, and remember 760 is the number we put on the table for Arizona in the alternative, there is no non-Indian agricultural water left in the state of Arizona. It was a bitter pill to swallow for those tribes, the Navajo Nation, to take that water off the table. So now we're in a situation where we're trying to get that through Congress, and we're trying to work out some issues that have been raised by the Upper Basin states. And we've had some really good discussions with them, and we're trying to work through those issues with them in a New Mexico settlement that went through Congress. There was a letter from the 7 states that basically said, hey, we're good with this, right? We're trying to follow that same path, and that's what this sticker is about, reaching consensus in a way that we can see support by all 7 states without making that support kind of a veto or a requirement of the legislation itself, because it's a political thing. So we hope to make that happen any day now. We hope that we can still move something through Congress in the few days that are left, but this is about drinking water, safe water for those tribes. I think you probably all know that the rates of COVID deaths on the Navajo Nation were exponentially greater than anywhere else because they didn't have water. They haul water. That's one of the issues, right? So the other key component of this settlement, much like our other tribes that have settled with us, is we want to give the Navajo Nation and the Hopi tribe the right on a voluntary basis to lease their water as they grow into the use of that water on the reservation. And it's not so much to provide water in the lower basin of Arizona. That is part of it, but these leases are going to be limited in term. But it's a way to get revenue to the tribes, because we have seen in every water settlement that I've been involved in, and it's quite a few of them in the state of Arizona, that over time, the money they got from Congress is not enough, sometimes not enough to build the project, but never enough long-term to pay for the OM&R to continue the delivery. So lease that water, grow into it, build up a corpus of money. It's a financial benefit to them to actually put their water to use.
Thank you. We talk a lot about conservation as if it's the silver bullet here on the river, and it's a significant, plays a significant role. But what about other supplies? I think about all the $4 billion and how it's been spent. Could we have been thinking more about other supplies like desalination?
I'll talk some about desalination. We have desal supplies in California. There's one notable one in the San Diego County Water Authority, and there's been other interest to develop some additional supplies there. In addition to desal, the Metropolitan Water District of Southern California is building their pure water facility, and there are others being developed throughout Southern California as well to take reclaimed wastewater, make it pure water, and deliver that as a substantial supply, which both Arizona and Nevada have helped contribute to that metropolitan project as well. But when we look at the silver buckshot that we really need for the river moving forward to steal, I will pay a royalty, I'm sure, to John Entsminger from using his phrase. Moving forward, it's really going to be conservation. We can think as much as we want to that we're going to develop new water from new technologies, but the reality is that conservation is tried, true, and tested, and it's pretty easy to do. You just have to do it.
Sorry, I just want to put some numbers on that because Southern Nevada Water Authority is a partner with the Metropolitan Water District of Southern California on the Pure Water Project. And for those unfamiliar with it, you're basically talking about, the effluent that is currently being discharged into the Pacific Ocean, treating that to a higher standard, building, billions of dollars in new infrastructure to distribute that through 4 different groundwater basins in Southern California and recharge those aquifers and then be able to conjunctively use that groundwater with the other supplies available in Southern California. And our projected capital contribution to pure water is $1 billion for probably about 25, maybe 30,000 acre feet of water. And that doesn't include O&M over the lifetime of those facilities. So yes, new supplies are out there and available, and they are incredibly expensive. So the $4 billion we saw, from this administration, thank you. but it's not going to, that will not make a dent in bringing new supplies online for this basin.
And so Jennifer, I just want to add, because maybe it's lost in the shuffle a little bit, that even if we do get those augmentation projects, we're going to need to store that water in Lake Mead in the Lower Basin to effectuate delivery. We're not going to build a pipeline from California into Central Arizona for pure water, right? Central Arizona Project is also a partner in that project. So we haven't talked much, and Carly didn't either, about storage accounts. She talked a little bit about that concept for both Powell and Mead. That's one of the things we've been working through to supplement our Lower Basin alternative. I know storage accounts have been really valuable in the past and will be in the future. I also know there's a new proposal, and Carly had it daylighted a little bit, this federal protection pool concept, which I think is a really important concept. It gives opportunity to check a whole bunch of boxes, especially for tribes in the basin, not just tribes in the Lower Basin, but tribes in the basin. And I think the federal protection pool concept is something that, at least right now, as we work through it, I'm really supportive of pulling that thread and seeing where we can go. And I believe there's a lot of tribes in the basin that are supportive of that concept as well.
And I just want to add one more thing on desal, because it's always thrown out as this panacea, right? This is the thing that's going to solve everything for us. It's not just building a desal facility, like they've done in Carlsbad. The Carlsbad desal facility is 50 million gallons a day. Our facilities at Lake Mead can pump and treat 900 million gallons a day. It's a small plant. But the bigger issue is the storage that feeds those Southern California cities, the 19 million people between Santa Barbara and San Diego. The storage is uphill. The reservoirs are in the mountains. The pipes start big and they get smaller. They telescope down. So I'd heard Jeff Keitlinger once describe desal as trying to give a blood transfusion through your pinky toe, because you have to rebuild all the plumbing to move the water uphill. So it's incredibly expensive, it's incredibly difficult, and anybody who throws it out as this, it should be part of it's one of the pellets of buckshot, but it ain't a bullet, and it ain't a cannonball.
Thank you. We're running out of time quickly here, and I thank you all for your attention. You have a lot of Upper Basin constituents in this room. As your final words, what would you like them to take back with them from this panel?
I'm not looking for a fight. I've spent my entire career, from, my first CRWUA was the interim surplus guidelines, right? I've been doing this long enough now that we once fought over how to divide up extra water, right? We're not doing that anymore. And I want everybody from the Upper Basin to hear from Nevada. We believe compromise is possible. We think it's the first, second, and third best option. But we need a dance partner. So let's get back to the table and make this happen. And hopefully you're not too offended by everything we just said.
So I agree with John, and it was big news when Tom asked Governor Hobbs to consider putting $1 million in her budget for next legislative session for litigation. But that was, again, Tom doing his due diligence. I have to do my due diligence for all potential outcomes. It is the state of Arizona's position and my marching orders from Governor Hobbs to find a collaborative path forward with all of the other 6 states and with Mexico. We're just looking for partnerships.
It's not easy to do hard things, particularly when you're doing it for the first time. And what we've developed in California and throughout the Lower Basin, I think in many ways provides a great blueprint for adaptation to the future we're going to have to contend with. The only question is, are we going to work together to do it, or do we want to wear jerseys and be at odds?
Thank you. Before we thank the panel, we're going to take a 20-minute break, and we will be back here at 10:50. Let's thank the panel. Thanks, guys.